أول شيء شكرا على قبول. Thank you for accepting the invitation. Um, let's start with the very general question about why do you think ethics is, or bioethics is very important to be considered when conflict happens? Very general blanket. Why it's important to be ethical even in the case of conflicts?
Let me take a step back first and then to put a foundation for our discussion today. So to begin with, why do we need bioethics in the first place, right? Or what do we need to consider the ethical issues in our practice or in research? Given that my work, and by the way, this is one of the things that I wanted to highlight as well, that my doctoral project was about the research, the ethical considerations in research conducted in armed conflicts. And obviously my case study is in that. So kind of like I went in depth about the ethical considerations related to research. Given that from my previous experience as well, I used to work in research until now in research ethics committees, and so my focus will be mostly on the research, on the ethical considerations in research. However, we'll touch on other aspects as well. Generally speaking, we have agreed in the field of ethics, or bioethics specifically, that there are certain standards that we need to make sure that humans are respected and treated ethically, whatever ethically means, and we'll discuss that as we go on in our discussion. We need to make sure that by our interventions, by the research that we are conducting, we are not basically causing more harm than benefit, and that the rights of the people are respected. But this is like general. This is general idea of having why do you need to care about ethics? Because there is power imbalance. If you think about it, between the doctor and the patient, there is power imbalance. Between the researcher and the research participant, there is a power imbalance. And this power imbalance becomes even more aggravated in armed conflicts, because people in armed conflicts, and we discuss it perhaps later on as we go. What makes armed conflicts specific, a kind of like um, a specific context that needs its own lenses through which we look at things. First is that the armed conflicts cause damages at different layers, at different levels. One of them is about the societal structure, the infrastructure, and we have seen this unfortunately for what's happening in Gaza, what's happening now in Sudan, and many parts of the world, unfortunately. So what happens is there's a complete destruction of the infrastructure. The basic needs like water, like food, the access to these basic rights are affected, which means that those who are affected by the armed conflicts are more vulnerable position, which means that there are more power imbalances between when I come as a researcher or the humanitarian worker or as a clinician or in any capacity. People are in need, which means that I am in a position to force the people to accept things that they would not accept otherwise. So, and this what makes perhaps the talking about ethics or the ethical considerations in armed conflicts is perhaps more important, or humanitarian settings in general, is perhaps as important or more important even when you talk about the importance of applying ethical standards and moral reasoning to our practice as researchers, as care providers, uh, as well. So this is perhaps the importance of talking about ethical considerations in us.
That will take me to think with you, and I invite you to think with me. When in the dichotomy of look, the English lawyer and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the French philosopher, both have kind of idea about human nature, and are we wolves in a way our innate nature is bad, or we are good and our innate nature is good. So in these kind of conflicts, what do you think is happening, and what is reveals from our innate nature? This is a very important question that would lead us to talk about what sort of principles that we need in terms of ethics to govern this kind of nature of innate.
first of all, to define what is right and what is wrong, or what is good or what is bad, and what is, are we good or evil in essence? I mean, this is a very big philosophical question. And in a way, it is relative and subjective in many ways, because basically, if you ask anyone, uh, even the perpetrators, those who killed the people, who bombard the people, who had all this, basically the genocide and these atrocities, they have a justification for that, and they have the courage, not only for themselves. It's not a matter of like convincing yourself that, well, for example, the self-defense kind of argument, but they have the courage to tell it to the world and to do it basically live, on TV. So the question is about what is the moral reference for someone, that could lead this person or these, groups of people to commit these atrocities, or to commit what we consider, as most of the world would consider, as crimes, against other innocent humans that are not involved in the compact. And perhaps, this is there's a term for that, as well, when it comes to the international humanitarian law. But this is, generally speaking, I mean, it's really important to understand that humans have always the capacity to justify what they do. And the moral reference could be religious, it could be personal, it could be a personal belief, it could be a political belief about the priority or the superiority of certain people because of their religion, or because of their color, because of where they are in the world as well. So this is in your question. However, I have kind of a challenge perhaps to this approach in the first place, because I think and this is one of the main concepts, one of the key concepts that I want to highlight, which is about the our source of knowledge about the right and wrong and good and bad by itself is inclined, towards, there is, at the global level, the epistemic injustice. In other sense, whose knowledge counts, whose standards count, whose standards of right and wrong counts. And perhaps we can discuss that as we go on, is about one of the main issues that they have, or the problems, or the concerns, if you wish, when we talk about the ethical standards or the moral standards, in general, and specifically in armed conflict as well, that they are based on different contexts. So, for example, if we talk about the development of research ethics, okay, the ethical standards of research, the kind of the very starting point, at least it's in contemporary form, is the Nuremberg Code, and then the Declaration of Helsinki, and then the SAMs, and all the guidelines that came after that, and the Belmont Report, 1979, in the United States, which established the three of the main principles of ethics that are still valid until this day. So what happened is that we have been guided, in a way, in our discussion, in our thinking, in our education, by ethical standards and by moral compass that is not necessarily a natural development of our own intellect. And unfortunately, we've been under kind of like moral colonization beyond the actual colonization. So, for example, the colonization ended in the region for decades now. But unfortunately, until now, I think we are in a position where we are kind of like hinged or attached to different set of literature and different set of thinking about things. And I believe one of the points that I want to make today, but it depends on where it fits in the points that you have prepared, is about we need to tackle this epistemic inequality or epistemic injustice, in the sense that whose knowledge counts. It's really important to understand that we, as global South, as humans in general, we need to think about the standards of right and wrong and the moral standards in a way that makes us kind of like some sort of equivalence in a way. We should not be basically copying and pasting models that not necessarily fitting within our context. Uh, And I have a few critiques, but perhaps let's go to the points, and then we'll talk about the critiques that I have of the issues that I want to raise about these so-called international or standards or international guidelines or whatever.
Okay, what are they? If you can just give us an idea about what are these, let's say, principles.
Okay, so the most common and most well-known principles, ethics principles. For example, we have the principle of respect for autonomy, which is basically respect to the person's ability and right to make the decisions about their own body, their own health. And for example, there's a principle of beneficence. It's our duty as healthcare providers, as researchers, to do good. And the non-maleficence, which is basically our duty not to harm or not to cause harm to our patients or to research participants. The issue of justice, where we need to be basically fair with the different aspects of or varieties of theories of justice as well. So these are, for example, they're kind of like the guiding principles. I mean, in terms of the ethical considerations in the humanitarian work, there are other set of standards. For example, there's impartiality, the neutrality, about so this is kind of like a different set of principles. So generally speaking, when we talk about them, then it's hard to argue that people would have a problem with when I say like autonomy. For I should respect your ability to decide about yourself, what happens to you, what happens to your body, whether it's in peacetime and or in wartime. So in principle, these principles seem to be okay. It seems to be working. It seems to be fine, which is the case. However, uh, when we talk about to what extent these principles are applicable and reflect the global south or the global perspective on that, because when we assume about the universalism, for example, which is basically that there are certain standards that could apply to all humans all the time anyway. So this is the very basic concept of universalism. However, we cannot, and I think it's really important to, as an intellectual exercise, when we discuss these principles, we have to understand that these principles developed in a different context after different set of events. World War II was the starting point where people like took, what the Nazi soldiers did to the prisoners of war and the concentration camps and the Holocaust and all of that. We don't this to happen. We don't want this to happen again. Okay, what we'll do that these are the principles. So the Nuremberg Code was kind of like the starting point from there. So we are talking about World War II that did not happen in our region. We have some involvement in it, and we were affected by it, obviously. But to what extent that this context represents us, morally speaking, or intellectually speaking, or just from a very epistemological kind of approach. And then the Declaration of Helsinki, the involvement of people from the global south in general was very limited, if at all. The member report is a US document that resulted from after the Tuskegee study and all the which is basically for those who are not aware of the study, it's just a study where targeted African American for syphilis. They were left uninformed, experimented without their consent, and they were not provided the treatment for their condition, which led to congenital syphilis and their death and the death of their spouse. So, and when this was discovered, that no, this is wrong. We have to set certain set of principles, and then these three principles developed, and the four principles by Bush and Charges, again, two American philosophers, and they have been like the gold standard, if you wish, of principles, and the principalism was the guiding uh, theory. It's not basically a theory, but a kind of like a mid-level theory, let's say, that is happening until this day, or guiding our discussion until this day. So I believe that we have been under kind of like the impact or the effect of intellectual products, which are not necessarily wrong. I'm not saying that this is I have a problem with the company, these guidelines or these principles as Western. This is not my issue. But the issue is to what extent that these principles are representative of our moral values. And I will give a few examples perhaps as we go on in our discussion.
I'd like to hear from you your opinion about why it's important in the time of conflict, war conflict, or armed conflict. Doing research is an extra burden. And if we suffer to make people adhere to ethical standard in regular days, what sort of difficulties we should endure to make people adhere to those guidelines in time of war?
Okay, so here we're talking about a few things. First of all, let's start with a very basic question, and it's a genuine question. People are now affected by basically they're being bombarded or attacked, and they are fleeing their villages, fleeing their cities, looking for safety, looking for the basic needs. For us, the question of like, let's go do some research, but this is a really odd thing to do. What we expect is that we should be providing them with humanitarian work, the humanitarian aid. They need food. Let's give them food. That they need medicine. They need vaccines. They need clean water, which is absolutely common sense. However, it's really important to understand that the humanitarian system, the global humanitarian system, which is led by leading UN agencies, like, for example, like there's a so-called UN OCHA, which is basically the Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. This is kind of like the central body under the United Nations to coordinate the work of the humanitarian work. And just to simplify, for those who are not familiar with the humanitarian system, it is divided into clusters. There's a cluster for health, cluster for education, cluster for protection, a cluster for logistics, and so on. Okay. For each of these clusters, there is a lead organization. For example, WHO, the World Health Organization, is the lead for the cluster of health. UNICEF, for example, for nutrition and education. The FAO, which is the Food and Agriculture Organization, is responsible for the food security. The World Food Program for the food security, and so on. So basically, and we're talking about like billions of dollars before the current cut by the current U.S. administration for the international aid. However, we're talking about quite a sophisticated system, and now this is only the UN agencies. Now there are many other players. For example, we have MSF, we have international organizations, the humanitarian agencies working in the field. So the question is, we cannot go to the field. Let's assume that I am an organization and I'm an agency. I want to help the people. I cannot just go to the field with some food and some tents and start distributing them. One of the most important points that or the starting point that we need to do is the so-called needs assessment. We need to make sure that what the people need and what is the acceptable way and how much of this is needed. We cannot just assume that, they need clothes, let's send clothes, or they need food, let's send food. It doesn't work like that. We have to have some sort of baseline to assess our intervention as well, and to make the budget allocation, given the high competition, if you wish, between different sectors. So to cut it short, so basically we need some baseline data for our humanitarian interventions. How do we do this data? But the needs assessment. Needs assessment in a way, among other issues. For example, if we want to be like research as a moral witness, and this is perhaps one of the things that I want to highlight as well, and this was found in my project. When I will go an example from my project and come back to link them together. One of the things that I expected is that perhaps you refer to this in your question, is about research as a burden. For example, there are some statistics that certain villages have been studied for more than 30 times by 30 surveys, while other villages, because of the security, where they are inaccessible, they were not unsurveyed, which means that the most of the aid or the help would go for those who are kind of like over research. And what I had in mind for a very, as a Western educated person, so I went for a very, individualistic Western kind of approach, and I have to admit that I looked at research as a burden, surveys as a burden. I have to, a lot of questionnaires, a lot of points and this and that. However, when I went to the field, when I went to the people, I found a completely different story. They were welcoming research. They wanted someone to knock on their door to ask, "How are you today? How are you feeling today? What do you need?" So in a way, they shifted my view to from research from a mere academic boring exercise of collecting data into an act of solidarity. And so it goes beyond the logistic need of humanitarian work into something bigger, into an act of solidarity. And they were welcoming. I mean, for it's a well, overwhelming majority of the participants I interviewed in my work, they wanted more researchers to come. They wanted more agencies to ask them, which I found really interesting because I didn't look at it because as an academic researcher working in like the boring stuff, which is basically just it's I'm collecting data, analyzing data, and publishing data, and that's it. Or to send it to the policymaker or to the agency to make their budget. But for the people, it was a completely different story. Okay, but obviously this was not almost always the case. There is other issues related to that. The second point is, or the other importance that I want to highlight for research is um, as an act of moral witness. In other words, we have to document what's happening. We don't want this to go forgotten. People, for example, using this of starvation as a weapon, which is against which is it's a war crime. Okay, if we don't have the documentation of the level of starvation and the level of malnutrition among children, among the people affected by the armed conflicts, it will go forgotten. It's really important to understand this. And one of the example, for example, it's again talking about at least example that I can provide is that in Sudan, for instance, the previous president was prosecuted by the international by the ICC, the International Criminal Court, based on evidence collected from surveys. These surveys were sent to the United Nations Security Council and to the ICC, and this provided evidence that these people are being starved. Rape was used as a tool in this. So again, research is not just a matter of like data collection. It's about it's an act of solidarity and moral witness that we need to provide this data for hoping that one day that those who committed these crimes will be brought to justice.
very deep, والله دكتور, الله يديك العافية. So, and it's not necessarily that I don't agree with all of that. As a friend of you and as actually a person who actually part of the bioethics upbringing in several contexts, I totally agree with that. But let me wear the hat of devil advocates here. If Nietzsche says that the ethics is just the tool for the slaves, in this context, the defeated, to tame the power of the owners, in this context, the winners. So isn't that kind of what's going on? The weak want to harvest some sort of power, and they used ethics as their weapon when they are actually defeated in the war field. I know this is a bad question, but I have to ask it.
No. Let's again back to the initial point that I started with. It's about the power imbalance. So whenever we as humans we try to defend ourselves and defend our interests and our rights in a way. So we try to do this in many ways. I think one of the approaches, let's say, of tackling this is that to find the balance between what we believe in as victims of war and what we perhaps, for example, the humanitarian system, the United Nations, for example, or
Mhm.
even those who are committing these crimes or having evolved in the war itself, It's really important to find some sort of a balance, a tool, because as I said, that people in the armed conflict are affected by the armed conflict. They are denied their basic rights: food, clean water, health, safety, peace. Okay, all these are basic human rights that no one should be denied. A way of approaching the international guidelines of research in a way that is consistent with the beliefs and the context of the people. And let me give you,
Okay.
yeah, a couple of examples, for example. So, for example, the one of the main principles is the respect for autonomy, right? It's about the decision of the people, the ability of the people to make decisions about their own self. However, one of the main problems, of the main critiques of these guidelines in general, and this principle specifically, the so-called that they represent the weird. And don't get me wrong, I'm not talking about being weird. Weird is basically the first letters of being Western, or to be more specific, being white, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic countries. This is kind of like the weird approach to ethics represent them. So what is the problem with that? Again, I'm not against this, but what is my problem with it? What is missing? Let's say what is missing is that first of all, the weird approach, or this kind of like the yeah, let's say, call it the weird approach for now, is that it's very hyper individualistic. It's based on the Western model of the nuclear family, which is basically it's all about I, me, and myself. Maximum, it's having a partner, having a wife, for example, and a couple of kids, and that's it. So it's
Yeah.
very, very small nuclear kind of structure. What is problematic with that? First of all, it takes decision making as an individual endeavor, as individual, right? The second is that it assumes that this person has the capacity to make their own decisions, that the researchers have the capacity and the resources needed for having the informed consent, which brings me to the second critique, with the second problem, which is first is the hyper individualism. The second is the proceduralism. So it's a very proceduristic in a way. So, for example, informed consent at one point of time it becomes a legal document. It's a way of protecting the university or the agency or the organization or even the researcher. I don't want to be legally, litigated later on after the research. That's why we see consents, especially if it's a clinical trial or something like that. I think you see this. It's 20, 30 pages of it's a legal document. It's not a matter of I'm respecting your right to know and the right to make a decision. So, and I think this relates to your doctoral thesis as well. It's about the concept of informed consent itself need to have the context in hand. I mean, let's face it. In Saudi Arabia, in Sudan, in the Middle East, most of the countries in the global south, we don't. This is not how we make decisions. We talk to the family. We talk to the elderly. We talk to the community leaders. This is in general. What's happening here? Let's the assumption that those who are affected by the armed conflicts are in a position to defend their own rights, it's nonsense. They are not. If they could, they wouldn't be like fleeing for their own safety and looking for basic needs. They are vulnerable in many ways. First of all, the assumption that they have the capacity to make a free, informed decision is invalid. It, it,
Hmm.
this is a fact. This is number one. The second is that to assume that the decision is an individual decision does not fit with the cultural context as well. And more importantly, what happens, one of the main impacts that I've seen in my work, and it's quite well documented in the literature, that there is a complete demographic and societal restructuring. Because look at it. If the family basically led by usually the male, the bread earner, the breadwinner. So and then they have the wife and have the kids. So what happens is most of the men are basically fighting, okay, and killing one another. So what happens is less and less men are available, let's say, to take the lead, which gives us more power to the community leaders or to the village leaders or to the leaders of this area, because now they are these children, mostly children and women and the elderly and the disease and so on, rely on these leaders to be their defenders, to be their informants, to be their gatekeepers, the one protecting them. Of approaching the international guidelines of research in a way that is consistent with the beliefs and the context of the people. And let me give you,
Okay.
yeah, a couple of examples, for example. So, for example, the one of the main principles is the respect for autonomy, right? It's about the decision of the people, the ability of the people to make decisions about their own self. However, one of the main problems or the main critiques of these guidelines in general, and this principle specifically, the so-called that they represent the weird. And don't get me wrong, I'm not talking about being weird. Weird is basically the first letters of being Western, or to be more specific, being white, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic countries. This is kind of like the weird approach to ethics represent them. So what is the problem with that? Again, I'm not against this, but what is my problem with it? What is missing? Let's say what is missing is that first of all, the weird approach, or this kind of like the, yeah, let's say call it the weird approach for now, is that it's very hyper individualistic. It's based on the Western model of the nuclear family, which is basically it's all about I, me, and myself. Maximum, it's having a partner, having a wife, for example, and a couple of kids, and that's it. So it's
Yeah.
very, very small nuclear kind of structure. So what is problematic with that? First of all, it takes decision making as an individual endeavor, as individual, right? The second is that it assumes that this person has the capacity to make their own decisions, that the researchers have the capacity and the resources needed for having the informed consent, which brings me to the second critique, or the second problem, which is first is the hyper individualism. The second is the proceduralism. So it's a very proceduristic in a way. So, for example, informed consent at one point of time it becomes a legal document. It's a way of protecting the university or the agency or the organization or even the researcher. I don't want to be legally, litigated later on after the research. That's why we see consents, especially if it's a clinical trial or something like that. I think you see this. It's 20, 30 pages of it's a legal document. It's not a matter of I'm respecting your right to know and the right to make a decision. So, and I think this relates to your doctoral thesis as well. It's about the concept of informed consent itself need to have the context in hand. I mean, let's face it. In Saudi Arabia, in Sudan, in the Middle East, most of the countries in the global south, we don't. This is not how we make decisions. We talk to the family. We talk to the elderly. We talk to the community leaders. This is in general. This is part of our of who we are as a culture. Obviously, there are some
Yeah.
changes happening. But when
Yeah.
we talk about let's put it back in the armed conflict setting. What's happening here? Let's the assumption that those who are affected by the armed conflicts are in a position to defend their own rights. It's nonsense. They are not. If they could, they wouldn't be like fleeing for their own safety and looking for basic needs. They are vulnerable in many ways. First of all, the assumption that they have the capacity to make a free, informed decision is invalid. It, it,
Hmm.
this is a fact. This is number one. The second is that to assume that the decision is an individual decision does not fit with the cultural context as well. And more importantly, what happens, one of the main impacts that I've seen in my work, and it's quite well documented in the literature, that there is a complete demographic and societal restructuring. Because look at it. If the family basically led by usually the male, the bread earner, the breadwinner, so and then they have the wife and have the kids. So what happens is most of the men are basically fighting, okay, and killing one another. So what happens is less and less men are available, let's say, to take the lead, which gives us more power to the community leaders or to the village leaders or to the leaders of this area, because now they are these children, mostly children and women and the elderly and the disease and so on, rely on these leaders to be their defenders, to be their informants, to be their gatekeepers, the one protecting them. So
Hmm.
one of the things that I found in my work and what I argue here is that uh, to respect the people's ability to decide is really important. Autonomy is important. However, we need to think or rethink the individualistic approach to autonomy to more relational autonomy, which means that decisions are not made in vacuum. Decisions are not made individually. They are made in context. They're made as a part of a dialogue. And we have to accept that. And we have to, if we want to basically to kind of like contextualize the principles. We're not saying that the autonomy is bad, it's very individualistic, it's so self-centered, it doesn't fit us. It doesn't work like that. It's in principle, it is good, it is important, but when we bring it to the context, it's really important to contextualize it and to apply it in a way that it becomes meaningful. Otherwise, it will be just a box to be ticked by the researcher or by the clinician or whoever providing the service. So this is one of the examples of how basically to marry between or to find a middle ground, let's say, between the international universal approach to bioethics, with example of respect for autonomy, for example, to more to contextualize it. We are still respecting the people's decision, but we are respecting the way they are making the decision without basically the I would say even the colonial approach of enforcing values that are not ours on our people. And I think it's part of our roles as well as academicians and as people working in the field of bioethics is to find this link to help the people to as again to address this epistemic injustice and to be not only basically to copy and paste the guidelines, to copy and paste the procedures used in the West or the US or in the EU, whatever, and to apply them like bluntly on our people. We need to find a way to contextualize this and to move from the individualistic approach that is in the weird approach
Hmm.
to perhaps something more relevant, more culturally
Yeah.
relatable to our people.
Yeah. So if I want to exploit your idea about the actually Western moral uh, assumptions creep into our thinking and put in the scale the concept of autonomy, for example. Let's put one of the most important documentation, most important events in bioethics that happens in the last, which is World War II, let's say. So what happened at that time is they have a prisoners of war. They did some sort of clinical trial on them, and they were very aggressive when it comes to their their experimentation without consent, without everything. We can understand that, but isn't that kind of overstretched to the fact that um, standing on the fact that they have to consent makes some sort of burden and stop the evolution of healthcare? We have a very important outcome comes out of the Nazis experiments, like the uh, let's say um, uh,
Yeah.
safety of aviation, for example, or hypothermia. These are regimes or regiments that's still used in our ERs and our industries still now, and it didn't come with the let's say the new way of thinking or the modern way of thinking of the concept of bioethics. So if I want to stretch your idea, I would reach to a point that it's okay to do this kind of research if everybody is accepted, if it's the only thing to be done in that context. So do you think this is where we are heading?
I think it's not an either or question. In other words, we can. One of the main reasons I believe research ethics is important in general is that human tendency to know has no limits. and if we're not stopped, we won't stop. Guided by curiosity, because we want to know more and know more and know more, and guided sometimes by financial benefit. And this is kind of like a more modern phenomenon, which is basically knowledge is money now, right? And we can see that the top industries in the world, the weaponry to produce weapons and to produce pharmaceuticals. So pharmaceutical are on the top earning, and now the technology obviously, but it's of the top earning model of business model. So the question is, so we need to have boundaries. We have to sometimes it's toothless, sometimes it's empowered, as we've seen, for example, what's happening in Gaza. Where are the humanitarian law? Where are the humanitarian standards? What are the ethical standards? We do not have police or international army for ethics to make sure that it is enforced. Fortunately, by the way, because otherwise it's going to be abused. Yeah, you know. So what I'm trying to say is, yes, we can learn a lot from basically practicing unethical or if we leave experimentation without boundaries, we learn a lot. But the question is, at what expense? What is the price that we need to pay for that? And who is paying the price? And who is gaining the benefit? So if you look, for example, the example that you just mentioned, I understand that, yeah, there are a few examples where even now the lay people going to the operation room or going to the next appointment in the hospital, they're benefiting from knowledge that we have learned by basically torturing and killing people 80 years ago. Okay, and not us. I mean, basically what the Nazi soldiers did. So the yes, this is true, but the question is it possible to provide beneficial knowledge that does not necessarily lead to the torture and to the killing of people? I believe that we can do. Obviously, we cannot get the same level of knowledge, but what happens is to make experimentation on the people with the, for example, this is, by the way, again, this is documented, and this is a piece that we are working on with two of my colleagues, including Dr. Tara with Dr. Asim Padilla, is about the use of AI in Gaza as a weapon, and there's been a lot of experimentation on the Palestinians by the artificial intelligence companies to kind of like to develop the AI models to make them more specific and so on and so forth. So yes, this is knowledge and this is useful. And by the way, this could be beneficial for the whole world, not just for the occupying state, but for the whole world. But the question is it worth it? I mean, how can we justify
Yeah.
the killing of all these people and the targeting of all these people because we want knowledge? There is a way. There's always a middle ground between gaining knowledge, the acquisition of knowledge, and the somehow of the ethical boundaries or some sort of boundaries, legal boundaries, ethical boundaries that need to be in place. Because if we leave
Yeah.
the scientists and researchers without these boundaries, terrible things would happen.
So, what would you think of a framework, a fair framework that would safeguard participants' rights and uphold human values? And to answer this point, I'd like to hear from two different voices: the Western voices and Islamic bioethics voices. If different, I'm just picking your mind on both kind of margins.
Their guidelines and our guidelines, it makes it unhelpful and unfruitful in many ways. Because I believe that if you want to target the epistemic injustice, it's not a matter of like fighting back or returning that this is not ours, we did not produce it, we refuse it. It doesn't work like that. From Islamic perspective, from cultural perspective, even from a human perspective, it's really important to be open to the ideas of the others. But the challenge is that when without the assumption that my values are higher values or to put it in a student seat. For example, uh, it might not be relevant, directly relevant to our talk today.
Mhm.
But
Yes.
again, for example, when the Western values, uh, have, for example, given rights to, in some contexts at least, to end your own life, to terminate the pregnancy without basically the right to free right to abortion, determination, okay, and the homosexuality among others, which is fine. I mean, these contexts, their contexts have agreed after a lot of debate and discussion and so on and so forth that these are the values that we want to believe in, which is fine. I have no problem whatsoever, and we shouldn't have any problem whatsoever with what other people believe in. The problem starts when the some sort the moral colonization or the moral recolonization, when the West coming back to us again to teach us that these are the standards. If you don't follow these standards, if you don't believe in these rights, then you are backwarded, then you are retarded, then you are developing and not developed, which is this is the main issue. I believe it's not a matter of like our
Yeah.
guidelines versus their guidelines. I believe that and this is part of our role. I think this even this forum, I think it's helping in bridging these gaps. It's I believe that the principles as they are now in the international guidelines are okay. They are great. They came after a lot of work and literature and discussion and debates, and we have seen the literature. And it's very rich, very very rich. But at the same time, this richness and this kind of like scrutiny through which these principles were developed does not mean that they are okay for us. They are okay in principle. However, how the way we apply them is the difference comes here. The way we apply them. For example, as you mentioned Islamic bioethics. So the our role perhaps is to find the respect for autonomy. It's there. It's mentioned multiple times in the Quran, the Sunnah, in Islamic teaching about the importance of respecting people's ability to decide. The beneficence. All the religion is about doing good and preventing harm, and it's about fairness. So these principles are there. The challenge is about the application, the introduction and the application. So, for example, I think, and this is the gap, is that some sort of like, I think this is a term that you coined, by the way. It's about this intellectual laziness, كسل الفكري. This is a term that you have coined, and which I use a lot. And I always give you the cover art, by the way, for this term. This intellectual laziness, it is moving, honestly, in fairness, that there have been a few movement in the philosophy in many Arab countries, and at least from what I'm following, that now the interest in revisiting our philosophy and to kind of have this level of critique from what's coming from the West in a positive way, not in a no, this is not ours, we refuse it. It's a matter of like bring it, put it on the table, but again with the epistemic quality. This is your knowledge in the West. This is our knowledge in our part of the world. Call us Arab, call us Muslim, call us Middle Eastern, call us African, call us Asian, call us the global South, whatever. This is our knowledge that we have been accumulating for hundreds and thousands of years based on our religion, based on our culture, based on our society, based on our family structure. This is based on our beliefs. And these are the Western principles which are fine for your context and for beliefs. Let's put them bring them together, and we accept what suits us in the way that suits us, rather than assuming that whatever works for them will work.
I totally agree with you, Doctor. So, I think the last point we want to discuss here is to promote awareness of the moral complexity surrounding research in the conflict context. Uh, what is our actual role as organizations interested in clinical research or research in general, healthcare research? What's our role in this kind of awareness, and what is meant by awareness uh, in terms of the morality of such very heated situation?
I believe that there are two main roles. There's a conceptual role and a procedural role. At the conceptual level, let's say levels. Okay? At the conceptual level, we need, I believe, it's a hard task, it's not an easy task, but we need to reframe our uh, vision to the ethical standards. So, for example, let's put all the principles that we have, that the international guidelines have, and so on. Let's put them on the table and kind of like reprioritize it. I'll give you one example from my work. From as a Western educated bioethicist, the priority to me was autonomy. Yeah, the people should have the consent and should be going to consent. And this is what my very first article that I was very much a strong advocate for consent. And this is like a tool of democracy and empowering the people and let the people choose and decide. This was like the enthusiasm that I had. But when I went to the field, it was important. But for the people in the field, especially in the armed conflict, for them, it's not a matter of informed consent. It's a trust-based consent. It means that they were not concerned about how much information I want to give them. The question to them was not how is going, am I going to benefit from this research? I'm going to be affected by this research, how it's going to affect me, and all the details and the consent, they didn't look at it. They asked me a completely different question. Are you a trustworthy person that we can trust with our information and with our houses to let you in? For them, it was about trust. If you're a trustworthy person, please, the door is open. Come, sit, ask whatever you want to ask. I'm going to answer. So, and again, so what happened here is, at least in my project, the autonomy was there, but it was applied in a different way. It was a relational autonomy. They have different model of decision making, and we have to accept that. And this is number one. Number two, that for them, trust comes before autonomy. So the principles are there, but the field work and for example, our colleagues in sociology and anthropology, and even in our work as bioethicists, is to find which principles should be given the priority, are more important to the people. So this is at the conceptual level, to critique the principles, rearrange them based on the priority of the people. Second is the procedure. So, for example, if we want to, I believe that again, it's a kind of like it will be a big leap, and I understand this, is to move from a centralized model of research ethics committee and IRBs into more, especially in armed conflicts, because basically, even practically and logistically, can you imagine an IRB working in the context of Sudan or Gaza, being bombarded? There are no hospitals, no schools, no universities, and it's extremely hard, even if we want to. Okay, so we need to have a different model. So, for example, back to my work, that what I found is that they have their own ethical oversight, because let's remind ourselves, IRBs are not the aim; they are a tool. They are means to protect, to make sure that the people are protected, that the moral standards or the ethical standards are applied, right? So if the people are coming with a new model of, for example, it could be a community committee, local doctors and community leaders and representatives from the village being attacked or targeted in the armed conflict, they sit together, they revise. You as a researcher go and this what happened to me, and I'm describing what happened to me.
Yeah.
I went
Mhm.
to them, talked to them, explained to them what is my research is about, who's funding it, why am I doing it, who am I. They asked me about my tribe and my family and how many sisters and brothers. I mean, in a classical research, we'd never go to this kind of discussion, right? But this is different. So at the procedural level, do we have the courage to move from a centralized research ethics committee or IRB model to something more decentralized, where the people can provide us with a different model of ethical oversight? If this is the more convenient for them, and this is more practical for them, and this is more applicable, more logistically applicable in armed conflict setting, then are we ready to make this shift? And I'm not saying by replacing let's cancel the IRBs and let it in the hands of the people. But what I'm saying is, we as IRBs, as research ethics committees, we need to have this moral imagination and the courage to think of different modalities and different models of applying ethical oversight. And to remind ourselves, the aim is not the IRB itself. The aim is not the ethical approval itself. The aim is to make sure that the people are being protected, and there's an ethical oversight on the procedures that are happening. How is this done? We need to have, again, the moral imagination and the moral courage to do that. Are we there yet? It's hard. It's hard to move, to make this shift from in the people's mind, when people are used in a very structured way of doing things, and been doing this for decades now. It's hard to change. But at least, perhaps our meeting today is one of the steps towards, like, let's rethink about the way we are doing things. So I think these are the main roles I believe that we can do at this level.
Very well said, Dr. Rayaq. You are always an inspiration. Deinstitutionalized the institutional review board. That's a very brave thing to say. I'm applauding my head now to you. So with that, I think we are almost spent 1 hour in this lovely discussion. I don't wish to stop it. So you would have like 5, 10 minutes, whatever time you want to conclude and give us your final thoughts on the matter. If you want to discuss anything else or to add to the point that was discussed, any valuable point. So I'm all ears. The
Well,
floor is yours.
thanks again. I think let me just perhaps recap or summarize the main points that I wanted to raise. First, armed conflicts have a huge impact on the people's daily life and basic needs. And this impact means that we, as the human world, the human society, the human community in general, we have a moral obligation, uh, as a matter of solidarity, to help these people. And to help these people, we need to know what their needs are. And to know what the needs are, we need to have some sort of data collection, which is basically, you may argue, and this is one of the things that, honestly, I don't want to go there, is about if is the data collection during armed conflicts is research or not. This is a completely separate question, because one of the main, let's say, maneuvers that done by some researchers, that they avoid calling their work research, not to go to the research ethics committee. But let's not go there. This is not the aim of. I don't want to distract our discussion. But anyway, so and this and this data collection needs to be guided by a legal framework and an ethical framework. Historically speaking, these guidelines, both the legal and the ethical guidelines, have been guided by the so-called international guidelines, and which again, to recap, that were developed for in different contexts by different set of historical events that are not necessarily relevant or applicable as they are in this, and this led to the kind of like the moral colonization or moral imperialism, in the sense that certain parts of the world, the previous colonizers, the West mostly, trying to kind of impose their standards on, or perhaps assume, that's not, to be fair with them, yeah, they sometimes they try to impose, let's say, assume that, give them the benefit of doubt. They think that what they have is the best, and that's why they are trying to convince the people in different parts of the world that these are the standards that they need to follow. What I'm calling for is the epistemic justice, in the sense that we have to be, this is the call for our Western colleagues, have this moral humility, this moral, epistemological humility, which means that be open to the idea that different people in different parts of the world have their own knowledge, their own way of thinking about things, and their own beliefs, which may or may not uh, come in accordance or matching the beliefs of different parts of the world. The other point is that when I call for the moral decolonization or bioethics decolonization, I'm asking for to have a dialogue between the literature and the guidelines and the principles developed in the West to those to the societal and cultural and religious values that we have in many parts of the world which are not in the West. How to make the balance? This is something to be done based on the context. I'm not basically advocating for like absolute relativism, but at least I'm calling for some sort of contextualization of these principles. And how this conceptualization takes place, I believe that, as I concluded at the very end, at the conceptual level, we have to revisit the principles that we take for granted, the autonomy, the beneficence, non-beneficence, to different set of principles, like, for example, for trust, solidarity, and so on. And this is one thing. And the second is to have or to think about different ways to approach the implementation of ethical oversight through be to have some level of flexibility of to our researchers. For example, consent should not be always written, should not be like 20, 30 pages. As long as you have the trust of the people to think of a way that moving from the informed consent to the trust-based consent while maintaining both. This is important, and to think about different modalities of ethical oversight from decentralized, institutionalized models like the Research Ethics Committee and the IRBs to more community-based, community-oriented setting where the people have the say about what is relevant to them and what is suitable for
Dr. Raya, thank you very much for this time. We learned from this discussions. I'm indebted to your kindness and to accept this invitation. Also, I extend gratitude to the education departments who actually did a great job in arranging this. Also to my colleague in the Ethics and Compliance Department,